Okay, and this is an important topic. For some people, this is where things start to get a little frustrating because it's sort of a major change. So let me bring up idle. So one of the things, what we've been doing is we have been making a function. We've been doing def main. That is a function. We're defining a function called main, and we've been putting pretty much all of our code in there for a lot of years, up until I'm trying to think of when the big change happened. Probably in the 70s. Just trying to remember. Code used to be pretty much top to bottom. You started at the top, you just kept coding. Anybody ever do basic, the old GW basic?
Is this the predecessor to Visual Basic?
Yeah, see, there was no visual initially. There was just basic. Microsoft added the forms and stuff and made it. Quick Basic actually came before Basic, and it was the modification that allowed it to do functions. Before that, you basically started at the top and work your way to the bottom with your code. That makes it really hard to debug, to find problems, and it makes it really hard to use code over again. One of the holy grails of coding is to be able to create objects that you can use over and over again. And when it's all written top to bottom, that's very difficult to do. Also, if you wanted to reuse something, you either had to rewrite it in there, or you could do something where you could say go to, and you would go to a line because most of these things had line numbers, or you could put in a keyword that would be a stop place, and you could go back up to that and then execute, and then you'd have to throw it forward again. That kind of code, it's called spaghetti code because it's utterly unreadable. It's a total mess. And that was okay when programs were fairly simple, but when they started to go into the tens of thousands of lines or the hundreds of thousands of lines, that actually it got undoable. So the next thing that they did is they broke code into functions. It's called structural programming. And the idea of a function is that every single function does one thing. All right, now it can be a complicated thing. It doesn't have to be a single line of code. It can do something complicated, but each function does one thing. And then the idea is that you could just call that function whenever you needed that one thing done, right? And you could call it from anywhere. Depends on the language. In C++ and C, all the functions had to be before you called them. But I mean, you had to write the function before you could call it. In a lot of modern languages, you can call it even before you write it. It has to eventually be there when you compile it. In Python, you would need it before you get there because it's an interpreted language line by line. But you can call functions, I mean, at any time. And you can make files of functions that are called modules that are just functions that you can call whenever you need them. That's what the math library is, essentially. It's just a list of functions. These functional programming took a backseat to object-oriented, which we will talk about, and I actually prefer object-oriented, but functional languages are making a comeback, partially because, well, a lot of particularly data analysis and stuff, it's really good. You don't necessarily need to build objects. You can just have a set of functions that do it. And some languages like C# or Java require you to have objects, but Python does not. So that's my shortcut of the history of structured programming. So each function should do one thing. So let's do a real simple. I'm going to just do file new. I'm still going to use the idea of main and call the first function in main. I just want you to know that in Python, you don't have to do that. You could just call the function, right? You don't have to put it inside of a main. But pretty much every other language that I know, you have to use a main. So we'll just do it as a good habit. Does that make sense? So we've done def main. You've seen that function. You've seen other functions too. You just may not have known it. When you do print and have parentheses, that's a function, right? You're calling a function called print and you're giving it some parameters. So I am going to do a really simple, kind of stupid function first. So I'll just say simple function. And I'm going to, the way you do it, I'm going to call it a cube. We're just going to cube a number. So just like def main, you do a def, and then you give the function a name. Parentheses. Later I'll show you how to pass arguments. We'll do this actually a couple of different ways just to kind of show the feel of it. So, and then you give whatever the content of the function is going to be. So I'm going to basically just, later I'm going to break this up a little bit, but I'm going to do, I'm just going to say number equals int input, enter a number, and then I will say, I'm not going to name it the same thing as the function. So I'm just going to do, as I said, it's a stupid function. But I just want to show some of the structure. So I'm going to do print the cube is my cube. Okay, so there's our function. I'm going to go to here and I'm going to do def main. And inside of that, all I'm going to do is call cube. And then I have to call main, right? So the thing is, I'm using main here because I want you to get into that habit. But you could just get by, the way we call main here, I could get by with just calling cube, right? You don't have to call main. You could just call cube directly. Does that make sense? So I'm going to run it in a moment. I'm going to comment it a little bit. Right. So if I save this, and I want to go to Documents, Python Programs, I'm going to call it cube function. You can call it whatever. And then I will run it. So I'll enter a number. Let's do 5. The cube is 125. So I said it's a really stupid function. It doesn't do much of it exciting, but it shows sort of an idea. How would you guys, does yours work? All right, so let's talk about this function a little bit. I said that a function should do one thing. Does this function do one thing, or does it do more than one?
It does more than one thing.
Yeah,
It takes a number, it cubes it, and then it spits it out.
Right, so you could argue that it does 3 things. So I'm going to leave this as is, but I'm going to create another one, and we'll try to break those up. This is where when things get complicated, is knowing which function to call when and do different things. So I'm going to do a file new, okay, and we'll kind of build it on. I'm just moving these over so that they are side by side. Don't know if that'll help or not. So I'm going to, what do we want to name this one? Simple function 2? Simple functions. All right, so I'm going to start, I think, with the same thing. I'm going to say def cube, although I'm going to, not derf. Derf cube is interesting. Def cube. And I'm going to define it as just my cube equals number times number times number. Now we have to be able to get at my cube somehow. Anybody know how done other languages? There's a couple of ways we could do it.
They had to do what?
Get my cube. One of the things, when we start breaking things into function, there's a thing called scope. I declared my cube inside of, over here, inside of cube. So it's actually can only be seen inside of that function. You can't see it from another function. It's closed in the block in which it's declared. So you have to be able to get it out of that function somehow. I'm going to show you one way. I didn't know if you'd know. You'd have to have other programming experience. Return. My cube. This is one way you can do it. What that means is that this will pass the value my cube back to anybody that calls this function. Does that make sense?
Passing.
So when I do this, you know how in Excel you can do a function and you say something equals?
Yes.
Yeah, so this will assign my cube to whatever variable calls this function. We'll do that in the last one here. There are a couple of ways to do this, and that's also what drives people nuts, is that because there are multiple ways to do it, figuring out which way works best can be an issue. So I'm going to do def input. Now, these don't have to necessarily be in order.
Isn't that already a function?
Yeah, I have to do get input. Let's do it that way. It's hard to talk and think. So we do a colon, and I'm basically just going to now number here, I'm going to change, I think I need to change a couple of things. Well, we could do this. This could work. I'll show it one way and then I'll do it another way. All right, so we're getting number. Let's do the return again. Next, I'll do a second version of this where I'll show you how you could pass them. All right. And then I'm going to do a def print. So we can't call it print. So let's say print cube. And I didn't do a colon, that's why I went there.
Print my cube.
But, and we don't have to name these things the same, but I will. All right. Now, we have three functions that are really not talking to each other much, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a def main and we'll call them and get the values out of them. Did you have a question?
Well, I know how it's gonna work, or how it's not gonna work.
Well, let's see if it, so I could have made a mistake, but let's do def main.
Well, oh wait, no, it should work.
It
but
should work.
You need a few things still.
Right, so one of the things, well, what do we need? So inside here, I'm going to say, so get input returns a number. So I'm going to call it number, doesn't have to be. This number actually is different than this number because it's in a different method. They actually don't talk to each other, but they will end up the same because I'm going to say get input. So that'll give us the number. The cube, I am going to say, now actually, will the cube go in there? This is the thing I was wondering.
An argument
What kind of argument?
number. How are you getting number into the cube function?
That's the part I'm not sure. I think you might be right that I need an argument there. So let's change this slightly. I was wondering about that because I don't think the cube can see the number even though it's out here. Where is my mouse? There it is. This is passing an argument. We've done that. When you do a print, like input has an argument, which is a text, a prompt, and then whatever you enter. Print has an argument, which is in this case this, and then the my cube. So print might need it too. Print might need an argument the way I've got it set up too. All right, so we get the input, and then I'm going to call cube. I'm going to actually just do my cube equals cube, and we'll pass the number that we just got. And then we will call print cube, and we will pass it my cube. Okay. And then we'll call main. So I was going to try to show something different than this, but this is actually, I think you're right, necessary. So these are arguments, and I wrote them in not exactly the order I'm going to call them, but I'm going to call get input, and it gets the number, and it returns the number. So down here, I call number, and it says get input. So if I say 5 up here, this will show 5, right? It'll pass that number to this variable. It's a different variable, and if you want, I'll go name them differently because they don't have to have the same names. All right, so then we call my cube, and we pass it the number. So this would be 5 again. So we'll copy that number, and then it will pass it to cube. So that would be 5 times 5 times 5, or 125. And it returns that value. So this number will be 125. When it does print cube, we pass it that. So it'll print 120. It'll actually print the cube is, and then 125. Does that make sense?
I got an error when I ran it.
Well, let me see what I get when I run it. So I'm going to save it. Right here. I just named it cube 2. So I'm going to enter a number, and the cube is 125. So what error did you get?
I got, it says, so when I, not initially, but when I enter a number, it then says trace back most.
What do you have to do? So you have print to get input, number, input, number, return number. That's it. Main number, get input. To print.
Okay.
Right, so notice I had to put my cube here on the print.
Oh, I see, the reason argument.
Right, so there's no argument to print
I
that.
see.
A couple of things I want to say about functions initially, and we'll say this when we do objects initially too, is that they are initially more complicated than just doing it all in one, right? This thing, let me just go over to not the answer. I keep losing my mouse. Anybody see it?
There it is. It was, I saw it. There it is. It's in typed copy, right?
That's where I want it. This is a lot more complicated than this, right?
Right.
And initially, when you're doing this, you will find that you're writing more code and more complicated code to break it into functions than if you just did it all together. That makes sense? But in the long run, as your code gets more complex, this can save you a lot. So if you know that something isn't printing properly, you know where to go, right? There's a one function where it prints. If you know that the calculation is wrong, you can look at the mycube, particularly if you're doing something much more complicated than this. If you're getting the wrong kind of, well, so print, the input, if your number is wrong, it should crash there if we have try to enter a decimal or something. It makes sense in terms of managing complexity up to a point. As I said, then we'll go into objects at one point toward the end of the quarter. Does it make sense? It does for you. How about others?
I can deal with it, but the actual internal logic of it is something I'm still trying to.
Yeah,
You just break it up into smaller pieces, and then you can use those smaller pieces in other.
One thing that might help,
right?
I wrote them kind of because I was doing it off the cuff. Again, I've lost my mouse. I know it's here somewhere. There it is. It might make sense if you did them, although you don't have to do them in order. And I'm going to cut that and put it above here. So if you think about the algorithm, the functions, every step in an algorithm is probably a different function. Yeah.
I would also suggest, rather than writing all the functions at once, write one function, test that function, and then write the next function.
That actually is probably true, yes. Particularly when they get a little more complicated, you really want to know before you go to the next step whether or not the steps up to that work, right? Particularly you get something with a lot of different complexities in here. You don't want to have to, okay, something didn't work, where did it not go wrong? If you know that everything was good up to that previous point, then you know where it went wrong, right? It went wrong with your new stuff. So when I reordered this, and there's no, it doesn't matter what order you write the functions, it does matter what order you call them. Does that make sense? So I reordered it a little bit because the first thing you're going to do is get input. Second thing you're going to do is calculate. And the last thing you're going to do is print out the results. Input, processing, output, right? And you can organize your functions along those lines if that helps. The other thing, I had meant to just show returns, but these two return a value. These two also, you can get values by passing them, right? And here's where we're passing. We're getting the number from the input, right? And it returns that number, so we're assigning it here. And then we pass this to this function. We get the result of that, and then we pass it to that function. If it helps to draw pictures, all right, that's not a bad idea. A flow chart is not a bad idea, especially when it gets complicated, right? One of the things that I would suggest just in general with programming that nobody ever does, despite how often I tell them, is before you sit down to actually write the code, make sure it's clear in your own head, whether that means writing it out just step by step as, like a pseudocode or just that, or whether you prefer to write out a diagram. But you should be clear about what you're doing before you actually sit down and write the code. It's if you're only struggling with the syntax, you're trying to figure out how does Python do this or how does Java do this. That's one thing that you can look up on Google. But if you're fighting with the syntax and the logic at the same time, you're just gonna get swamped. Yeah.
So is that planning ahead kind of analogous to how, like, if you're developing a SQL database, first you should probably like draw out the ERD.
You should
before start
diagram
actually
it. Yes, you
writing
should diagram it. You should understand the structure of it before you actually build it. And that's true of a lot of things. I mean, programmers just want to leap into the code, but it's almost always a bad idea if there's any kind of complexity there at all. Okay, so let's look at some more functions. I don't expect this to go, I mean, it may take a little while to get the hang of this, and we'll spend a little time on it. So those are functions there. Let's see what else let's do something a little bit more complicated. I'm just going to make another window. So let's think about, you guys did the conversion to kilometers, right? So how would you break that up and do it as functions?
You need to get the input.
Right. So I'm actually going to write this up as comments first. So you want to get the input. And we're doing it miles to kilometers, or were we doing it the other way?
I think I wound up doing this, but
So let's do it in miles, I guess, and then we'll convert to kilometers. Then you do the calculation, right? And what would the calculation be? Calculation, because usually if you're doing some kind of like input or algorithm, you would do the math. So it's
1
miles.
mile equals 1.6.
So times 0.6. I know there's a bunch of decimals in there.
Yeah.
Not 8.6. That was supposed to be times. We could, if you want to get more decimals, we can.
It's 1.609 if you want to go that far.
6 what?
609.
609. All right, and then you print out the results, right? Now we will we're going to start adding a lot of complexity in the next few days. One of the things, as I said, today we'll talk about functions and things, and then I will give us at least some peer exercises where you can do the one in-class ones before we get to the other ones. But we'll start adding some complexity in terms of, we're going to look at ifs and loops in the next couple of days too, in a more complex way. And putting those in functions and stuff is starts to be a little more challenging. We'll do a couple of them here just to give some examples. And then, as I said, we'll do some other stuff. All right, so if we do these in order, we could do a def, what do we want to call it? Get miles? And then again, we've done these before with main. So the only difference is that you name it differently. All right, so with the input here, I'm just going to get the input. And so we'll do input. Do we want the miles to be, so float? Input, enter the miles. Okay. And I'm going to return miles, right? So I'm going to get, so we can get the miles. Does that look good? All right, so then I'm going to just do def. We'll do the calculation, right? So I said, when you think about it, if you write down each step, and some programs have a lot more steps, you would do these, probably there's a function for each step. Does that make sense? If you're writing it out as functions. So I'm going to def, I'm just going to call it calculate. You could call it calculate kilometers or whatever.
We'll call it convert.
Or convert. You could call it convert. You don't want to call it convert, especially since I spelled calculate wrong. All right, and we need to know what we're converting, so we're going to pass in the miles. Although you could do, I just want to show how would I do. There's not a good abbreviation for miles. I actually don't suggest doing this, but I just want to show you they don't have to be the same.
Okay.
The reason I don't suggest it is that characters like M, X, Y, unless you're dealing with points X and Y, generally they're not very descriptive, right? They don't, when you're reading the code, it doesn't make sense what that is necessarily. And I'm only doing it just to show that what I pass here doesn't have to have the same name as this. So I am going to put a colon there, otherwise it won't indent properly. And then I'm going to say kilometers equals M times, and actually we should probably do a, I'm just going to say 0.609, but we should probably make that a constant. What?
I think it should be what, kilometers are more than miles. So it should be 1.609.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
God, those walls are paper.
What?
Those walls are paper.
They are, I know. The other thing is, can you guys hear me in the back? Kinda, or is it bad? All right. Well, let me know if you can't. It's a long room, and it's a noisy room. So, let's just put it in as a literal there. Constants are a little bit weird in Python, so deal with those later. All right, so we'll return kilometers. All right. And then I'm going to def print kilometers. And I'm going to do, just to show they don't have to be the same. Print
Wait, can you explain again what you mean just they don't have to be the same?
So last time when I did this, I wrote miles here and I wrote miles here. I just want to show these are actually different variables, but one gets copied to the other. Does that make sense?
How does it know that M is miles?
It doesn't. And it wouldn't know that even if I wrote miles. It doesn't know what it is. All it knows is that it is expecting an argument. And in Python, it isn't even clear what that argument is in terms of whether it's an integer or a float or it'll take anything. All right, I could put George there and it would be happy. It would crash in the map, but the parameter wouldn't complain.
But so it would take it because that get miles function is right above it? Like
No, it honestly has no idea what it means. It's up to you to make sure that it gets what it wants. So when we do this, when we pass it, maybe when we do that, it'll make some clear. So it doesn't know what K is either, right? one of the things to know is that computers don't know anything. And if it isn't explicitly told. So all it knows, all this function knows, all that Python knows is that it's requiring a parameter. It doesn't know what that parameter is.
Okay. You're just telling it basically, go look someplace else for this thing.
Well,
that I want
so
to
when we
define.
call this function, if we call it without passing a parameter, it will complain. So it's actually not, I'll show you when we do this. So let's do print. I'm going to say print, I'm just going to print the kilometers. All right, so right now, these functions are not talking to each other at all, right? They don't know anything about each other. They don't know that these are just three independent functions, even though in our minds we know that they're doing, you know, a sequence of things. They don't know it. I mean, they're just separate functions. The way that it happens is where you call it, and we'll call them in main. So I have to call get miles, right? And it returns a value. So let's, I'm just going to this time call it MLS or whatever, equals get miles. So if I put 5 in here, I don't know why 5 is always coming up, probably some psychological reason. So if I put a 5 in the input, this will be 5, and this will return miles. So miles gets copied to MLS. So MLS will now be 5. So when I call convert, so I'm going to, I'm just going to do K's equals convert, and I'm going to pass it MLS. This MLS, this variable here, gets copied to that M. Yeah.
You're missing the T on the end of convert.
Yes, there's that too. Has to be spelled right. Does that make sense? So we have called get miles. We're going to get an input. We're going to put a value in, some kind of value. It's going to return that value, whatever we enter. It's going to return it. What it returns means is that when I call that function down here, it will copy this to whatever I name the variable down here. It literally just copies the value. If it was 5, this becomes 5. If it was 7, this becomes 7. It just makes a copy of that value.
But in the get miles function, did you need to return miles then, or?
Yes, you have to. Otherwise, it won't show anything here. If I call, like this one doesn't return anything, so I can't assign a variable to it because it doesn't return any values. This one doesn't. It just returns nothing. Right? In other languages, they call these void because they don't return. Void is returning nothing. It just does what it does and it's done. Right? Whereas this one, it's like in Excel when you do a square root function, it returns a value, right? It returns a number at the end of the square root. You say x equals square root of something. This is the x that gets returned as a number.
Okay, so even though there's the miles flow input, that doesn't return anything. That's just there.
It doesn't return until you actually say return. It does assign whatever you enter gets assigned to the variable, right? So it gets copied into the variable. If you remember what a variable is, it's just a memory guide it tells you that something is stored in memory and it gives you a name to identify it. So when we return miles, technically what it's doing is it's returning whatever number is at that address in memory. Right? But it actually is copying it. I'm not sure I'm going to go into that, but Python returns everything by value. That means it makes a copy of it. Other languages differentiate between value and reference. So if it's not a simple value, a simple number like a double or a float, if it's like an array or an object, it doesn't make a copy of it. It just says it's at this memory address, right? So it's more efficient. That's a minor thing. It matters a little bit in other languages. It doesn't matter so much in Python because it doesn't do that. But it's just copying it. It's making a copy of whatever you enter as miles. This gets copied to here when we pass. So the MLS gets copied to M. It doesn't matter what their names are. That's why I was naming them differently. Gets copied to that, does the calculation, it returns the kilometers, right? Which is just a variable name for a thing in memory, whatever the result of this calculation is, right or wrong. And then that, when we haven't done it yet, but I'll pass KS, and KS will get copied to K, and it'll print that out. Does that make sense? It's a little bit, it's more complicated this way, but in the end, it can help you because you're isolating everything into its own function. So it's easier to figure out where things go wrong or where things happen. Also, this isn't a good example of that, but you can write functions that you can call over and over and over again, right? So you don't ever have to write that code again. So if you're like the math library has a square root function, you never have to write your own square root function because it's already been written. You can just call that function whenever you need. Does that make sense? And writing a square root is a pain. There are, most computer science books usually have like a half a chapter on the algorithm for writing a square root. You have to keep, there's different ways to do it. Keep dividing by the, what?
It's just the number times the number though, isn't it?
That's the square.
Oh.
The square root.
Oh, okay.
All right, so I have to call the other function, which is print, the printed. So I'm going to say print kilometers. And then I'll pass it the KS. And then the KS gets mapped to the K. And this should, I'm going to say kilometers, functions, whatever you want to name it. So I didn't call main. Yes, thank you. I wrote main, but I didn't call it. The way you call any function is to name the function with parentheses. If it returns something, you can assign the results. Right, but main doesn't return anything. Main never returns anything. So I'll save that. Okay, so we'll enter the miles. I'm going to do like 55, and that should come out, yeah, 88. I was always surprised in Canada when the speed limits were like 80 to 90. Okay.
Can you go back to the other?
Yeah. Did you have? Yeah. I think this is so simple. You called the and so you need to count them. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
No, probably crash would be good space. If you want the space, go ahead. Let's see what we got. It's not too hard. Not really hard. Yours work okay? Yours is okay. Yours is okay.
Yeah, I didn't work at first, but I figured out why.
Yeah, well, so it is rare that a program runs first time through. Almost everything I saw going around was a typo, right? Something not capitalized that was capitalized somewhere else.
Right.
Yeah.
In my case, my first attempt when I defined it as main, I wasn't passing them in the correct way. I wasn't referring to them the right way.
Let's try one more of these. I don't want to kill, and then we'll do the file thing too. What is it? It's about 11,
It's 10:55.
10.
It's 10:55.
Okay, right. So almost 11.
Yeah.
That clock always, I know the minutes are right, but the hours are way off. Is it making sense, more sense?
Oh, yeah.
So I'm going to do another one that we did. As I said, we're kind of killing a dead horse, but I really kind of want to build this in and then just keep doing it. This one, I think, let's do the one you guys did as a pure exercise, because this one has some loops and things. It's a little bit more complicated. The one where we figure out the average length of each word. So we'll just say figure out the average length of a word in a word in a sentence. That's awkward, but anyway. All right, so what were the steps? Do you guys remember? I know it's been a week or more since we did that. Yeah, so you need the input, right? So you need to get the sentence input. You guys remember what the next step would be?
You split the sentence.
That's right. So you split the sentence into words, right? And you would loop right through the words.
Yep.
And get the links. This one, I don't think I'd make a separate function for it, be part of the loop, but you would total, basically total the links. And then you basically divide the total length by the number of words. And then print the average, right? So there's a lot of steps there, and they're a little bit more complicated. Where do you think the functions would fall? If you were breaking this into functions, how would you do it? And there is some arguments of how precisely. So you probably want to get the sentence, right? That would be one function. You could, I think I would do the next two together because it's natural in the loop to total the lengths. So I would loop through, I would split it.
Split
Right.
and then.
Yeah, I said spit, but I would split it. And you could do, if depending on how precise you want to be, you could split it past the array of splits to the part that loops through it and gets the length and the width. I mean, it depends on, I've seen people that would combine everything except the print, all of these into one thing. And I'm not sure I would argue it, but let's split it up as finely as we can just to get the gist of it. Does that make sense? We'll try to split each step out. This is a little bit more complicated, and if you actually think about this, it gets harder, than what we've done so far. You guys okay with that?
I mean, if you're trying to split it out into as many, if you want each function to do one thing and only one thing, then you would make each step its own function.
Yeah, I mean, the better form is to split it up so that each thing does one thing. But that makes it much more complex than what we've done before. So the first one is easy, right? We're just going to get the sentence. Some of you might have noticed why I put a space here so that there's a space between my input and the prompt. Some of you, particularly with a number, if you press enter, it may cause an error if you're entering a number. With the sentence, it just gives you a leading space, but that leading space may still screw you up when you're splitting. Yeah.
Can we test each function as we go?
Sure, we can try that. So if we're going to do that, and we're going to return get sentence. Or not, we're going to return. I didn't assign a thing for it.
Yeah, you want to do it like my sentence or anything?
Yeah, we'll just do sentence equals. And we'll return sentence. Now, one of the things you can do is, so it's going to, this is, I'm just going to do, actually, let's make a function, def test. We'll try, we'll put it into main later, but I'm going to do, or just delete it or comment it out. I'm going to say, print, you can do this too. That makes sense? Except it needs a parentheses inside. If a function returns a value, you can do something like this, right? If it doesn't return a value, it won't allow you to do that. To put the function in here, because what this says is we're going to just print the sentence.
Gotcha.
So let's just call test. So I'm just going to do test. This is actually pretty close to unit testing, where you test a function. You create a test function to test a function. So I'm going to do I'm going to save this. So we'll do what do I want to call this? Word length, I guess. Word length, average word length. Let's call it average. Okay, and then I'm going to run it. So I'm going to enter a sentence. And it doesn't matter what you do here. I'm just going to enter garbage. And it prints it out. So it is doing that, right? It's returning the sentence. Does that make sense so far? Noticed I didn't need a main, but I do like to keep it with a main because most languages need a main. Any questions on that function? One advantage of testing it one by one is that you'll catch your typos faster. All right. So the second one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to split the sentence into words, into an array of words. See if I remember. So I'm going to do def. I'm going to just call it split sentence. And this one is not going to be quite as independent as our others because the first thing I'm going to do is...
Do you need to pass it the sentence?
You could either pass it or you can do like my sentence equals get sentence.
Oh, okay. I see.
And then I'm just going to call it words equals, no, I don't remember. Did we need square brackets for that? I'm maybe confusing other languages. Equals my sentence split. Is that right? Or is it split with my sentence in the parentheses? I'm confusing languages now,
I
so.
think it's my sentence dot split, but you have spit.
Yeah, it could split, I guess. Split. Do you guys remember, do you need the square brackets?
No, do not.
Not complaining, although it might when it runs. How would we test that?
Right. Also, you have root run instead of return.
Oh, wow. Typing is not my forte today. If that gives you any help. So we did print sentence. This time let's, we just want to call split sentence. So I'm going to say words equal, actually I should have left the other one. Can I undo? I want to go back to where it was. I'm not going to run this test again. Oh, maybe we should. Let's run it. Yeah, I'm going to comment it actually. I wanted to leave it so that it's there when I post this later. So,
Maybe you just
so let's do sentence words. We need to get the sentence, right? Equals split sentence. Spell that right? Okay.
Couldn't we just do the same thing like print and then?
Well, so what I want to do though is I want to see the words, right? Because there's no way you can print a list just by saying print. I don't think.
Because you can't do print the split sentence.
Right. So what I want to do is for probably we could do I in a sentence were in range, right? Sentence and then parentheses. 0, sentence words. Actually, it's length. LEN, isn't it LEN parentheses length? All right, colon, and then I will print sentence words, square brackets I. So it should print out all the words in the sentence, one at a time going through the array. Yeah.
I'm missing a T in that's what sentence.
Oh, synonyms. This is typing is not my friend today. Partially it's talking while typing, but still, I do that kind of stuff a lot too. We'll see if this works. So this is our test. The test is we're going to enter a sentence, and it's called here, so you don't have to call it again. It's going to get the sentence, right? It calls that, this function calls that function in order to get the sentence, and then it splits it. And you could have passed it. There's another way you could have done it. You could have passed it, right? You could have put it in an argument here if you want. And then I'm going to return the words, which is the array of words. Down here, I'm getting the words, I'm mapping them to sentence words, and I'm going to loop and see if it actually gets split up the words. So we'll see. I'm going to do Control S to save this, and I'm going to run it. I have invalid syntax near test. Why? Oh, because I didn't finish my parentheses. All right, so save it again. All right, so I'm going to enter a sentence. The long, I don't know, I have no idea what to enter. The long day is about halfway done. And it worked. My test tells me that the split is working. The long day is about halfway done. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Did your guys' work?
No, but I know what I did.
Okay, how many didn't work?
Oh, no, mine
Yours
didn't work.
worked. Yours didn't work. What do you do? You got the sentence. Oh, you know what? Because you probably didn't. I commented about that. I just commented about that. Well, just put a hash. That's why that's what it is. You guys get enough here? Yeah. Where everybody else's work? You're good. Oh, yeah, a few more things. So actually, you can see up there where it's at. Now let me get it back up so you can see it. Yeah, I want to get the code back here. So when you do your loop, you have the top line, but you need to print the sentence words I. This is just printing where it is in the array, and the I is just a counter. Did yours work? Yeah, that looks okay. And then you return words, print. You might want to comment out the first print.
Oh.
If that's the problem where it's saying the same thing over again. So save that and save that one. Did you just work with it? Still the way. What is the error that it's giving? Okay. Yeah, that is. All right. Okay. It doesn't know what it is. Oh, it's split. It's what do you have? It sentence dot split.
They're the same. A sentence.
Dot split. Sentence dot. I think that. Sentence, it doesn't know what sentences. Oh, that should be get some. Well, so you need to do, let's see, we got. I think you want to just get the sentence first. I think you're missing the line. Sentence words equal split sentence. I think I had split sentence up here. Oh, actually, before I got that, my sentence equals get sentence. I think that's what I'm missing.
Missing the.
Yeah.
parentheses. Okay.
So it didn't know what your sentence is.
I was trying to split it instead of this.
So we've split the sentence. See if it works after that, does it? Okay. Then we want to get the links. And I'm going to do this a little. So we returned words, right?
We returned words.
Yeah, I mean, we could pass words too, but we returned it. So I'll make another function with. Do you want to return it or you want to pass it? The way you would pass it is you would name the next function and just pass the array.
In the
Yeah, in the parentheses. It would work either way.
Yeah.
So I am going to do def. What do we want to call this? Get total word links. I'm not sure how I want to say this. All right, this is a horrible name. You can name it something better if you want. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to get, and we can name it the same or something else, words equals split sentence. So we're going to get this array. We need to loop through it kind of like we did here. So and one of the things, this one might be better if you passed it.
Okay.
It'll work this way. Well, let's go with it as is for right now. I'm going to change this to words. Words. And we're not going to print it right now. What we're going to do is we're going to do a counter. Up here, I'm going to do counter equals 0. And so inside of this, I'm going to say, counter plus equals words or length, len, words, square brackets, and I. Does anybody know what that line is doing? Do you guys remember?
It's cycling through each word and adding a number to the counter for every
Right.
letter.
So if the first word is 3 letters, this will be 0, right? The first time through, this is 0, the counter. So it will go back and, or the I in this is a thing. So for the 0 one, say the letter, it was 3 letters, it'll put 3, assign 3 to the counter.
Do you have an equal sign there on purpose?
Yes.
Okay.
What plus equal does is it accumulates.
Oh, gotcha.
So the other way to put this has exactly the same effect, although I'm going to comment it, is to say counter equals counter plus len words I. Right. So what the plus equal does is it keeps adding it to itself. It accumulates it. These two are exactly the same. So I want to do, so this is actually, I want to return, do I want to return anything here? I might want to pass things on, but for right now, let me change this, but let's return counter to see what the total words are. And this is just for the test, right? So I'm going to comment this out. You could create separate test functions for each one of these. I'm rather than commenting them out like this, I'm just doing this. So I'm going to say print get total word length Okay, you guys got that? I know it's hard to see around it's low on the screen. I'm not sure how to lift it much. I guess I could press enter down here a few times. Hopefully that won't hurt anything. All right, so I'm going to try to run it. Well, yes, I have to save it. So I'm going to enter a sentence. Now, if we look at that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. It should return 21. And it returns 17. Oh, because it's the words. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. That's correct because it splits it on the words. Right, we split it. We're not counting the spaces. Did it not work?
Stupid colons.
What do we have as an error? So it's try to spell it.
I don't understand how it's the same as the acid.
Yeah, I'm going to change it to passive. Because I think we want two values out of this, actually, if we're gonna do the calculation. We need to get the total word length. We also need to get the length of the array. Like how many objects are in the array.
It ran, but it totally got the wrong number. Just got the length of the first word.
So when you do your split, object plus equal length word.
So it's only turning the length of the first word.
Oh, do it plus equal, not equal plus.
Can you switch to go back to
Yeah. No.
now?
That word.
Now just through a total error. Let's see. Where's that?
You have to do the counter up above. You have to say counter equals 0.
Oh, I see.
You can't do a plus equal operator
Oh, I
if you
see.
haven't assigned it a value before.
I see.
Did yours work?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if they make, I don't know, spell check.
You know, they don't, I don't know of any,
Has
ID that has, yeah,
Dyslexia in the room.
because it can, I mean, when you jam words together and stuff, it's
Yeah,
really hard
I
to spell.
Yeah,
Ours, How about the others? So we're getting there. This is a lot harder, right? Because of the, just it's a more complex problem. You guys with me? So we have up at the top. So I want to change this instead of returning the counter. I'll show you in a moment. Let's do the next one, which is to calculate the average. And then we're pretty close except for printing it out. So I'm going to do def, and I'm going to just call it calc average. Could be word length.
Yeah.
So in here, if you want, say, average word length, I am going to take two arguments. We've never done that before. I want the total, which will be the counter. And I also want, I guess I'll call it size. Size is the size of the array. You could call it size of array if you want, or size of list. Because we need to, in order to calculate the average, we need to figure out, we have the total, we need to divide it by the number of elements in the list. So one of the things about return is you can only return one thing at a time, right? So that's a problem here because we need both of those values. So one of the things we could do here is we could just call the function, if I can find my, there it is. Instead of return here, I'm going to say calc average word length. And I will pass it the counter, that's the total. And I'll pass it the length of words, right? So a couple of things about this that we haven't done so far is notice I'm passing two arguments, not one. So I'm going to pass the counter will get mapped, and then the length of the words will get mapped, the size of the list. Again, it doesn't know what's going on. It maps first to first, second to second. It just by position. It doesn't understand any of the terms. So it's up to you to make sure you get the terms in the right order for what you're doing down below. Right? So this argument, this thing calls for two parameters instead of just one, and we're passing it two parameters. First gets mapped to first, second to second. Does that make sense? It's just position. It has no awareness of what things mean. So in here, what I will do is I'm just going to say average equals total divided by size of list. And I will return average. So let's see if we can test that. And then we will do our prints and our main. So we need to do this, we actually need to call, to test it, we actually need to call get total word length, because it's the thing that calls this, right? And then we would need to print the average here. Does that make sense? It returns the average. Let me do it and then we'll see. So this is test. Everything else has been commented out. I'm going to say get total word length. Actually, so returning average doesn't work. How am I going to do this? I pass those two values to here. We get the average. We could print the average right there, but or maybe we should, I don't know. We could pass it on to print, but we would almost have to, because return doesn't work there because it's being called up above. Does that make sense? Unless we do this. And then this should actually print the average. This is where it gets hard, is figuring out how the things relate. And then there's another step which we're not doing yet, which is where you try to generalize it so that it can be used in as many situations as possible and isn't so bound to one program. We're not going to worry about that right now. The way it is right now, get total word length. We should diagram this. Count calls split sentence. Split sentence calls. If I can move up here, where is my split sentence calls get sentence, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this calls split sentence, which calls get sentence. It gets the words. It so it's got the array. Then it goes through and it gets all of the links to the words and totals it. And then it passes this to the average thing where it sends it the total words and the number of, or the total length per words and the number of words. This calculates it, returns it back up to here. So if I call this, it should print the average. It's a bit of a labyrinth how things call each other. Let's try it, I guess. And then I might draw a diagram of this at some point. If not today, then next time. Or I'll do it and put it in the blog so you can see it. Oh, I got an error. What is my error? Get total word length. Did I spell it wrong? Again, I need. Oh, that's the wrong one entirely. All right, so get total word length. Oh, it's get total word length.
Oh.
Did I spell something wrong there? Oh, I didn't say return. I didn't say return average. Now what is the error? Or is there an error? Where is my thing? Get total word length is not defined. Capital W. Thank you. Now, I think, why is it so, it's telling me to enter a sentence, but I can't get to it. There. What is it if you do 1, 2? Well, let's just do. I'm going to do the house on the hill again. That should average out to about 3 point something, or probably 3 point something, yeah. 3.4. All right, so if I can find my thing again. This is really complicated in how things go. So I call get total word length, and it calls split sentence. Split sentence calls get the input, right? Input sentence, so get sentence. All right, so it actually runs get sentence, split sentence, then returns the words. We set the counter, we loop through it, we get our totals, and then I'm going to call the word, get the average word length. I'm going to pass it the total characters and the total number of words. And then I'm going to, that will assign the average, so it'll call this, it'll do the calculation, it returns average, assigns it to this. I'm going to return that again so that I can print it out down here. Does that make sense? I think I may need to draw this as a picture. This is where functions can get a little bit weird. It's just, as I said, they can do the how they call each other and how they do it. So let's do, we've tested them so far. How did most of yours work? No? Let me, so yours didn't work. Let's look at that. Anyone else not work? Before we go on.
Mine had, I mean, it just displayed this, whatever that means.
All right, so let's look at your thing. Put parentheses after the total length.
Oh,
Open and close. No, the parentheses, that parentheses is right, but you need parentheses inside.
oh, inside the.
See how it says get, I have to get total word
Oh,
length?
I see. Yeah, yeah.
Because it's a function. When
Oh,
it didn't
okay.
return it as a function, it thought you were just giving it something else.
All right.
So we have Coming around this side, everyone working okay? You guys doing pretty good. This is much more confusing than I meant it to be. In terms of this one exercise, but yeah.
So is the function calc average word length, is that not necessary then, since we have that average for the get total word length?
Well, so this actually calculates the average. This is just a word, right?
Okay.
Well, so this is calling this function, right? So the actual calculation happens right here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's still necessary. So the very last thing I'm going to do is just to print. And basically, so I'm just going to say print def print average. And it's going to be basically like this. I'm just going to copy that. The only thing is I'll just say in front of it the average word length in your sentences. And then I'll close that in comma. So that's the only difference I'm going to make. It's going to call that get total word length, which calls all the others, right? So because this calls everything else, basically this makes everything else happen. When I do def main, so I'm actually going to, we can actually just leave test if we don't call it, but I'm going to do def main, and I'm just going to call print average. Actually, the only method I need to call in main, because again, get print average calls get word length. Yeah, get total word length. Get total word length calls the split, split sentence, which calls get sentence. Then it does its looping and it calls the average. So basically, from this one function, all the others are called. Does that make sense? Maybe we can draw this. I will draw it, as I said, but I may. And then I'm going to call main. Now I can leave test if I want. The thing about having a function, if it's not called, actually it is called. That's comment it. I don't want to call it. You can leave def test here in the sense because if it's not called, it just doesn't run, right?
Right.
Having a function, if it isn't explicitly called, it doesn't run. I'm going to try it and then I'll try to walk through. So does it say enter a sentence down there? Oops, wrong one. Oh, come on. I'm going to kill that. And then I'm going to try running it again. The reason I killed it is so I'd have a fresh one. So that's a lot of words. It's not something that's easily testable, but the average word length is about 5, which is about right. And you could format that if you wanted to look neater. Yours not work. Yeah, let's look at the code again. You did yours work okay?
Yes.
Okay.
I had capitalized average in the def main, but when I fixed that, it was fine. Didn't like it at first. Fine, the same.
What was the error? Well, there's no error, it's just I'm putting the total amount as opposed to average, so. Why should we say, yeah,
So when you do this, when you return average, but you've only got a return counter there in the get total length. So look at the, let me bring this up to where you can see that. Now if I can get my cursor in here.
oh, I see, so it's.
So I'm returning the average after calling the average here, and you're still returning the total, so it's doing what it says.
Okay.
I'm gonna draw, maybe just try to draw a quick. So. Okay. All right, so let's just draw a little picture of it. We'll call it a day, and then we'll do a little bit. And I'll post all these on the blog. I think it'll be a verbal picture rather than a diagram. I could bring up Visio, but I'm going to bring up Notepad. Oh, I don't want Notepad. I'm not doing well today. All right, so I just want to do it in the order that they're called. So when we do main, we call get total word length, right? Total word length calls, so total word length, I'll just do it this way, calls get sentence, and then it calls a split sent. What did I call that? Split sentence.
Yeah.
And then it calls average, right? Calc average. So those are kind of how it runs. So in the main, I only need to call get total word length. And it also calls print. So it calls print average. Right, so total word length calls all the other functions, so the main only needs to call it. Does that make sense? It's a little unclear sometimes when you're just trying in the middle of it, looking at the syntax. But total word length, the first thing it does is it calls get sentence. It takes that sentence, passes it to split sentence where it splits it out. Then it gets the totals and it calls calculate average. So it does that, it returns the average, and then it passes that to be printed. So those are the kind of the structure of that. All right, so I think I'm going to let that be for today. I will post all of these. And then we'll do the file one next time, and I'll also start introducing some other stuff. And I'll have a little exercise for you guys to do in class on Wednesday, Thursday. Does this make sense to you guys at all? So if you want to read more of it, it's chapter 6, functions. Right. And as I always say, you could do other exercises. The thing with the assignment, I don't think, again, following Stanley, I don't think there's another assignment till chapter 8. And I don't know why that is, but I'm going to cover the stuff in between and give us some in-class assignments. Yeah. Okay. Oh, is it giving the file?
Yeah, the SS.
You can't get into Canvas. So don't get in Canvas. So don't do that. We go to files. I'm not sure why I'm asking you. I thought I gave access to it. Anyway, there's a graphics file. Just download. So download. And then wherever you want it to be, put it in the same folder as it. So you don't have to read it, but you can. But once it's downloaded, you don't have to open it. You just have to add it. Because basically what it is got all the functions you want. It's a library of Windows. Graphic functions is based on. It's basically a simplified version. Right, so download it from the files. Maybe for some reason isn't working. I tried to refresh that. I was able to move it to a public folder. Okay, let me post all this stuff. Oh, and stop the video.